might be a good idea to, not forget to turn the live stream on. So today it's going to start off with a small intro to Adam Smith because Marx always references Adam Smith. So it's good. Yeah, so it's really good to have a background on him. Then we're going to start going through Marx's life, especially like him meeting Engels, what they produced, Marx's deportation to Brussels. He'll- And after a little bit, we're going to take a small detour, go over theses on Feuerbach. After that, we'll come back to his life for a little while and end on a discussion on authority, which I am excited for, but also terrified. Yeah, no, multiple people in this class have notes specifically to debate on this topic, and I'm kind of scared. But we'll see how it goes. Either way, it should be a fun class. Also, if anyone is watches the live stream in the future, Mike's going to be kind of shit today. So let's. I don't know if that was audible last week though. I don't rewatch these afterwards, so I don't know. Either way, we're going to start off with Adam Smith.
Okay. Um, Adam Smith. He was born in Kirkcaldy, Fife, Scotland in 1723. He was a Scottish political economist and moral philosopher. Um, his moral philosophy isn't as appreciated as his economic work. His magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, was massively influential in the development of political economy as a field. And though he's most famously treated as a founder and advocate of free market capitalism, his views on capitalism are much more diverse than are commonly represented. For instance, he believed that the division of labor that is created by capitalism would eventually destroy humanity and would subsequently require state intervention. He had a burning hatred of landlords, calling them parasites who reap what they do not sow. And he was hugely influential on Marx's economic work. Smith's rise as a economist and philosopher of the free market was primarily during the Cold War, because the United States saw that Soviet Union had philosophers to rely on and cite, while capitalism did not have one great philosopher to cite and use. So Adam elevated to the great founder of capitalism as we know it today. Yes. Yeah, and on that last point, Marx's early piece, Rent of Land, cites Adam Smith 21 times in about 8 pages. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, Adam Smith is always brought up, so it's just good to have a little bit of a background since Marx won't really shut up about him up until like Das Capital. Adam Smith is always referenced, so the name just comes back around pretty frequently. But enough about Smith. Now we're getting on to Marx and Engels. So shortly after their meeting in Paris, they started working on three very large works: The Holy Family, The German Ideology, and Marx solo on the Poverty of Philosophy, which more like hit piece, or well, more like drive-by. Hey, yeah, no, like and yeah, like we'll get to that for sure. But these three works came out in pretty rapid succession right after Marx and Engels met. After this point, we've kind of got the vibe that Marx takes forever writing. He likes to make sure that he has the entire work in front of him, completed, so he can look it over again and again before it submits to publishing, and this often causes delays. However, within 4 years, he publishes three whole books. That is rapid for this dude. But this came at an expense. Last week we were looking over the manuscripts, and they never got finished, partly because Marx got so swept up in so many other projects. Towards the end of 18, towards the beginning of 1845, barely a year after he arrived in Paris, this the uh, the French, due to pressure from Prussia, deported Marx and Engels to Brussels. Engels went back to England for a while. He never really got too swept up in that, but Marx was pushed away. We'll get into that part too, basically right now. But the Holy Family, that first work that Marx and Engels worked on together was expansive. It was meant to be a short little pamphlet. It was meant to be just maybe a few pages, just something to get an idea of how families are influenced by religion and just generally criticizing some philosophers. Then it turned into over 200 to 300 page piece that was just all critique. The original name was going to be criticism of critical criticism, and the name change to the Holy Family was basically decided on solely by Marx. Engels really did not want the name changed to the Holy Family because his name's on the cover. Let me call Marx and Friedrich Engels, I guess.
Well, the translation is critique of the critique of the critical critique. But it was changed because their editor said it wouldn't sell, so they made it the subtitle.
Yeah. So Engels didn't like that change because he comes from a pretty religious family. Now, Friedrich Engels was an atheist. His family was Protestant. I forgot what exact like subcategory of Protestant, but they were viciously religious. So the idea of seeing their son hun, on in a book titled The Holy Family and it involves atheism is something he was terrified of. But the name stuck, and that's what it was published with. The work argued more or less about all machinery and how it affected the working class. At this time, in 1845, 46-ish, a lot of workers were in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Their jobs are quite literally being taken away by machines, so people would go and smash the machines. And they talk about how well, it doesn't actually affect the development of what's going on, much like how not using AI won't stop AI. He, it is still something that people are doing because one, it's symbolic, breaking down the machines, refusing to use AI. It still carries a symbolism that's meaningful to the individual. And also, they are attacking the point of contention that's directly affecting you. So that was one of his big things was defending the working class in their destruction of machineries. In addition to that, he argues against this idea of peer criticism, where peer criticism was this idea of like ideas critiquing ideas. You see this a lot in philosophy, where you abstract an idea and then you argue against this abstract idea back and forth. And Marx, his big thing is ideas alone don't mean anything. There needs to be some action following it. If there's no action in like following those ideas, you can debate all you want, and ultimately it doesn't matter. So this was one of the first works Marx and Engels worked on together, and was also meant to be one of the last works Marx does in relation to Bruno Bauer. Now, Bauer and a few other people still appear here and there in Marx's later writing, but this is his like, okay, I'm this is like my final, like I'm done directly contending these guys. At this point, I'm like settled that. But he wasn't just sitting in a room writing. He was a living, breathing person. And when he was in Paris, he was getting out there. He was going to talk with people, meeting anarchists and socialists and communists and liberals and this.
That you said liberals.
He's pointing. Yeah, sorry, you're just.
Besides liberal and communism class.
But like, he was out there debating and talking with all these people, and there were groups forming, and he was part of some different groups. And Prussia knew these groups were against Prussian authority. So they would send spies there, and they identified Marx as a potential leader of these broad leftist groups. So they started a pressure campaign on France to expel these guys. So Marx was effectively forced out to Brussels. It was the only place he could really go with ease that would accept him. And he hated it. God, he hated it. Imagine like your favorite city to ever potentially live in. For me, it would be Berlin. For some people, it could be Paris, like Marx, anywhere. Imagine getting to live that life, living the idea of like, for Marx, living in like deep study, surrounded by all this high culture where you're able to contend new ideas in a politically interesting time, and then being sent to the middle of like a middle of a random country in a technically big city, and just in a place that you don't speak the language, in a place where you don't have access to all the same libraries or or most of the same thinkers. And that was basically Marx's life. The world he was building around him got ripped away. So he grew depressed during this time. It was a struggle for him. And while Marx left ahead to go build up a life in Brussels, he left Jenny Marx behind to clear up debts. This is actually something pretty common in their life is Marx often will go ahead to wherever they have to move to, while Jenny stays behind, selling what they own and clearing up any debts. This would be the second time that's happened now. The first would be when they moved to Paris. So just something to kind of keep in mind that oftentimes Jenny is the one assigned to like stay behind and clear up while Marx goes ahead to try to figure something out.
Do you know how they're compared to other like relationships in the time period?
I really don't. To my knowledge, it, if I'm making a guess, I would assume it's a little unique, not highly. I know Marx, especially from a lot of his writings, like we'll get into some next week, was very he like he saw men and women on the same footing. So I don't know if this him going ahead, she's staying behind was because they're like, okay, we just need to divide this labor, or if it was cultural, or if it's like some type of sexism that was just not critically thought about. I really have no idea.
Because it looks like sexism that wasn't critically thought about.
Yeah.
And division of labor.
Yeah.
Because it looks like the Northern European like dividing of money as a feminine labor source because it's in the home, witchcraft. But like, I don't know.
That's no, that's
Not
fair.
your dread lecture.
No, you're good. That's why I have these lectures because I like having these questions. But yeah, no, it's just a pattern that they end up falling into a lot. But Marx and Jenny eventually got to Brussels, and while there, Marx doesn't really shut up. Marx likes to yap about communism, and he was drawing some crowds. He didn't go alone. There was a flood of German refugees now going to Brussels because of the pressure campaign on France. So while there, he started drawing crowds, and Brussels was like, "Hey, you keep doing this, we will jail you." So he stopped giving talks, but they didn't police his writings as much. And at the same time, while he was in Brussels dealing with this, Engels went back to England to finish his study of the conditions of the working class. This book ends up being a pretty large summary of just how capitalism affects working people. Honestly, if you read the book The Jungle and you want to read something that's like a real life study that's similar, that's what this book, to my knowledge, was intended to be. I haven't read it myself, so I could be a little off with that, but to my knowledge, that was the intent of this. Also, while he was finishing up his studies, Engels meets a woman named Mary Burns. She was, yep,
The conditions of the working class in England of 1844 is still like regarded as a key source on the development of industrial relations in England at the time. It's still used today because of how detailed it was.
yeah, yeah, no, it's a big book.
That was a full decade before the beverage report.
Before the what?
The beverage report.
I don't know what you're referring to.
That's the British, like, talk about how the working class is falling apart. They got their preschool lunches because they were falling apart the country so much that most of their men couldn't serve in the Boer War, and they did this big overhaul and figure out what's wrong.
Huh.
So Engels was doing that really, really early, like a century before.
Yeah.
And ignored him.
Yeah, no, I mean that's pretty typical with them is that they kind of just get ignored a lot, especially during their life. But yeah, so Engels eventually meets this one like Irish immigrant to England named Mary Burns. She honestly, while writing up these slides, I realized she's almost like the polar opposite of Jenny Marx, as in like Jenny Marx came from nobility and married Marx, who is being poor. He's very uh, he he's constantly struggling throughout his life to make ends meet. Well, Mary Burns kind of has the opposite. She comes from an extremely impoverished family. It's Irish in England. They're not there because they're rich. Um, and marries, well, not really marries. They don't ever truly get married. It's a partnership. But she meets and forms a life with a business owner. And it's interesting how they come from how like he and Mary comes from polar opposite backgrounds because it was known at the time and within the Marxist circles that Jenny and Mary they didn't like each other. And honestly, I wonder if a big part of that is because of their class upbringing. Jenny, especially when they start having kids and as their kids start growing, really prioritized to try and make her kids have the life that she had, giving them a upper class education, get upper class like socialization, even if they aren't actually upper class. So I wonder if a big part of their like interpersonal issue was that Jenny had that outlook and Mary came from a working class family. Yeah. But something I wanted to mention because she is a constant presence in Engel's life. I sadly have not been able to explore her much, but she is a constant presence in the background, and her death greatly affects Engels later on. Yeah, you know exactly what I'm referring to. Yeah,
Spoilers.
yeah. There's a really fun letter. I'm sure when we get to it, Brian will go off about it. Hit up like when she died
Is
between
that what Marx
Mark.
asks him for money again?
Yeah,
I knew that was.
yeah.
Well, I'm very sorry for your wife. I'm also going to die if you don't give me.
Yeah, he's like, I'm sorry your wife died, but money? I need payment? I'm not working for you, but I want money. It's like Marx's that's basically how that letter goes. There's more around that time, there's more context, but it's really funny just thinking of it in that way. But yeah, Marx moves to Brussels, and eventually Engels joins him there, and they jointly work on a work called the German ideology. He, which we'll get into more in a moment. And at the same time, well, and also during that time, Engels was like, hey, I just finished studying the working class in England. You want to come back with me to England and see the people that we've been talking about, see the working proletariat, see the people impoverished in factories? Because Marx didn't really see that when he was in Paris. He was hanging out with other intellectuals. He didn't see that when he lived in Prussia because the town that he lived in wasn't an industrial town. So it was Marx's first time actually engaging with the people and the processes he's been writing about. And kind of changes Marx a little bit because he's like, oh, you can write about something all you want, but when you see it, it makes it real. This is no longer just ideas out in the ether. These are actual things affecting people. But also, while he was in England, Marx didn't know English. He barely knew how to read it. He tried to study English before this. His method of studying it was trying to memorize all of Shakespeare.
He was very good at that.
Yeah. So he knew Shakespeare well. He just didn't know English well, which is an interesting combo. But yeah, they when they got back to Brussels, they started working on the German ideology. And now this work wasn't published till 1932, but not for a lack of trying. The German ideology was meant to be published. It was a fully fleshed out work, and every time they found a publisher, they were turned away. Eventually, they found a publisher. He agreed. They paid him. He got paid. Like Marx Engels got paid up front, and then the publisher still pulled out. So it became a kind of lost work up until the 30s. And it was titled The German Ideology because, well, it says the German ideology a lot in the book, so we're going to call it the German ideology. It's, yep.
Yeah, it wasn't published because uh, the censors thought it would be a dangerous work to release. Um, but Marx and Engels thought they had gotten around the censors by writing it in a sort of satirical style with a lot of jokes, like Max Stirner, a saint, and all that. But eventually they couldn't get around the censors. They figured out.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of, yeah, so the German ideology is it was like a lost work, but it came back. The goal of the book was to again criticize the young Hegelians, Marx's favorite thing to do, and also attack this ideology called true socialism, which they saw as very idealist. It was very much like kind of like modern day Trotskyists, not saying Trotsky specifically, but like kind of the idea of mm, just like it was just very idealist, very like not applied in any real way. It was just lots of ideas and not much of action. Also, in the middle of working on the German ideology, Marx got an idea for another book, to write against Feuerbach. So he wrote down some theses on Feuerbach, which he planned on extending out into a wider work. But he decided not to. He decided not to continue working on Feuerbach and just moved on from there. The theses on Feuerbach, which we read this week, were only published by Engels after Marx's death many, many years later. And ultimately, like for theses on uh, and yeah, ultimately with German ideology, we'll get back to that in a moment, but that theses was meant to develop materialism as praxis, not just a history of arguing against Feuerbach, not just a like broad takedown, but also meant to be like, hey, but let's do something now. So we're going to actually read through the theses on Feuerbach and discuss it today. I figured it's a nice change of pace. I see you dying over there. This is going to be a fun discussion, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm just listening.
So, we'll start with thesis one. If anyone wants to read it out loud, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll just do it in a moment.
Chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, non-subjectively. Hence, In contradistinction to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which, of course, does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, really distinct from the thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. Hence, in the essence of Christianity, regards the theoretical attitude as the only genuinely human attitude, while practice is conceived and fixed only in its dirty Judaical manifestation. Hence, he does not grasp the significance of revolutionary, of practical critical activity.
Yeah. So, what do y'all think about that first thesis? I guess, yeah, but
It's a solid claim. Like he makes a claim and he backs it up. I mean, he says, "Look, here's my no."
yeah,
The thing that it's similar to. I mean, like want us to talk about what we think. It reminds me of the similar charge against Hegel that they're making earlier. Where they're like Hegel is thinking of things backwardly, or Hegel's thinking that God creates man, and the opposite is that man creates God. So it's kind of like this, where it's saying that that Feuerbach is only thinking of uh, as it says, reality is only in the form of object or contemplation, but it's not something that's actually practiced. So this seems like this is going to touch on, at least in some form, the much later quote of, the philosophers want to talk about the world, we want to change it. So it's sort of manifesting the beginning of that critique of philosophy.
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, he's starting to just get into this critique of like idealism versus praxis. And he moves on to theses 2 and 3. The question of whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking in praxis, the dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that this is isolated from praxis is a purely scholastic question. So I feel like like that second one, also hits upon something I know you and I have been talking about a lot, is this idea of what is objective truth? Can there be objective truth? And right here, Marx is saying, does it really matter if there is a theoretical objective truth? What matters is what is around us. We can argue all day if our perceptions are real, but if a fire is burning the house down, sitting there and questioning if the fire there is real or if our mind is playing tricks on us, doesn't really save you from the fire burning the house down.
I would agree, which is why I just don't get why he insists on using the words subjective and objective, which for me, staying within that framework seems to me to undermine the very question of practicality. Because I mean, how many times does that dichotomy, subjective objective, is that how many times is that used precisely to undermine people's lived experiences by saying, "Oh, well, objectively, your experience isn't true. It is imagined. It is a figment of your imagination. It is a purely subjective thing. Subjective being used as essentially a means of mass societal gaslighting.
Yeah.
I
And
mean, so I would contend that insofar as Marx keeps trying to insist upon objectivity, he is in effect reintroducing, I would say, a kind of idealism here. Again, how does one define idealism? These terms for me are still questionable because, from my understanding of subjectivity and objectivity, it's an epistemological construct. It is primarily epistemological. Harkens back to Descartes, which and then of course gets reprocessed through Kant, and then through Hegel. Um, so I don't get why he insists upon these terms. I really don't.
yeah, I would honestly say the main reason why he does is because at this time he's like the scientific revolution is like curtailing to an end, and he's very much caught up in that movement.
Fair.
So his idea of objective versus subjective,
Mhm.
one thing Marx does a lot, which is what makes him a early sociologist, is that he's trying to effectively develop a science of society. He doesn't want to just throw ideologies out onto the world. He wants to develop how does the world actually work under our system. And his subject and the subjective versus objective dichotomy, I feel like isn't exactly what Marx is getting at here. I feel like his thing with your experiences are, yeah, they're subjective, but they're influenced by objective factors surrounding it. That that is like the main thing I think he's trying to hit at is your experience is real and valid. Let's look at how society has influenced those experiences objectively, how like actual like movements of people that were recorded, actual uh grand social systems that are exerting power to create your subjective experience. I think that is a dichotomy he would get at there
Mhm.
when it comes to idealism versus materialism.
Right.
He still would see, I would just like a person's subjective experience
Mhm.
as being potentially materialist. The thing that makes it idealist is the assumption that the ideas alone
Sure.
are what makes the reality. He says it's the reality that makes the ideas that are developed.
I just feel like that neither one of them can be said to truly have the completely determining effect on the other. That's the whole the whole question of which determines which. Does consciousness determine? Do material conditions determine consciousness, or is it vice versa? And I'm left here thinking, well, I don't think we know enough, and I don't think we have a standpoint by which to speak of a strict determinism.
Yeah.
No, just interesting about this. What I was mentioning earlier when I was reading Anarchist or Socialism by Stalin, he was talking about justice, and they all keep going back to it. It's um, like Stalin made the specific point that like things existed before consciousness existed. They had to, and so
Yeah.
things come before consciousness. Things preceded. The chicken or egg question that we're having here is that things do come first, and that's what Marx is trying to say here. History proves this fact, or else you would have to believe that the world came into being when human consciousness was invented, which leads to God, which is what Marx always talks about, this idea that idealism always leads back to God. That's what he's always harping on about in all these things. That's why he doesn't like the young Hegelians and stuff like that. It's all related. Yeah, that's the way I see what he's saying here, at least.
I would say it's a false dichotomy. I mean, my personal take following Heidegger is that what really comes first are social practices, which are neither subjective nor objective, and then when we step into a philosophical realm, then we divide phenomena into subjective and objective. But really, primordially, Marx is onto something here. That practice is what is primordial. And that is what is most important. That is the richest phenomena right then and there. I'm completely there with Marx. I just think that the richest way to that he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to get into he wants to study practical lived human experience, as I'm gathering. That seems to be what he's saying, but he wants to do it through the lens of science. And I'm left there thinking, you're going to filter out an awful lot there, buddy, just to get to claims of what is subjective and objective. You're going to have to simplify a lot of phenomena that's there. That's my take.
Fair. Yeah. That's fair. And like, here, I'm going to just move us forward to point three. The materialist doctrine concerning the material doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and the upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and that it is essential to educate the educator himself. This doctrine must therefore divide society into two parts. One which is superior to society, uh, I am blanking on how to pronounce that word.
Coincidence.
The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-changing can be conceived and rationally understood as revolutionary praxis.
I feel like this is exactly what Ethan was just talking about.
Yeah.
Where like the changing of circumstances, the circumstances are changed by men. And that so like basically what that before that the circumstances that they existed before that the world I mean as Ethan was talking about, like this is also this period when you're starting to discover, like we're making scientific discoveries and we're actually starting to say, no, we can definitively state that the world is older than it, the Usher chronology is wrong. The world was not created on a Tuesday in 4004 BC. In fact, we know the world is, at that point, they're like, the world is millions of years old, and we know it's older, but they're starting to develop this concept, and so we know that the world exists before humans exist. So the physical realm, it exists. We know it has existed before, but what is going to change, what's going to affect a change on things is going to be people doing those changes. We have to think of the changes, conceive of them, but then we have to follow through and do them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly.
That's what I feel.
Yeah. And then we got point 4. I read the last slide. Anyone feel like reading this one?
I'll read it.
Go for it.
Feuerbach starts out from the fact of the religious self-alienation, of the duplication of the world into the religious world, his work consists of resolving the religious world into its secular basis. But that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds can only be explained by the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular basis. The latter must, therefore, in itself be both understood in its contradiction and revolutionized in practice. Thus, for instance, after the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the holy family, the former must then itself be destroyed in theory and practice. This one's hard to understand,
Yeah.
I think, a little bit.
Yeah. For me, the main thing I got out of it was he's kind of hitting a bit on base and superstructure, I think. He never explicitly calls out base and superstructure. That is a concept that was ripped out of Marx to explain Marx. But what he's trying to get at here is like reality influences ideas. Those ideas then turn into practice, and then those practices affect reality, creating new ideas. That's what I'm getting out of this. Effectively destroying the old conditions that gave rise to those original ideas. So, in other terms, and to explain base and superstructure with this, let's say this is going to be base. So what you can think of this as like real world conditions. This can be here like the weather today. This can also be like have you eaten? When did you eat? What are you eating? Those types of things. It also includes economic systems in a bit of a way. It's economics, depending on how you define it, is either base or superstructure. If you're looking at economics as in how things are positioned and get to other people within a society, then it's base. If you're looking at it from the like, what are the like laws and social norms that function to develop these to develop these movements, superstructure. It's something that kind of exists in the in between and you'll see it often thrown into the base if you ever like take a sociology class or something, but it's something that, in my opinion, exists in both, depending on what aspects you're talking about. But yeah, base, material reality. This then goes and influences what's known as the superstructure. So the superstructure, that's the ideas, that's the philosophies, that's the laws and lived like those are the laws and like religious experiences you hold. Those like ideas, Marx says, they don't come out of nothing. Like you're saying, the chicken or egg problem in relation to ideas versus reality is reality, like something had to exist before your consciousness. Like realistically, he nothing just popped in out of nowhere, like y'all were saying. But when someone does exist, they affect reality. Their conscious lived experiences, the ideas they develop, affects reality. But they came out of this reality that created them. But they then in turn affect the base. They change it. We develop these new ideas of economics. We implement different social systems. We decide, hey, it's a good idea to chop that tree down and make that tree no longer there. But that tree is no longer there. The material conditions have now changed. These idea and effectively the old world no longer exists. The world where that tree existed doesn't exist anymore. That's not reality. But this new reality that was affected by an idea now exists, this new material reality, which gives rise to new ideas. We have all this lumber, maybe we'll build a house. And now that we live in a house, maybe that gives me different ideas of what a home can mean, which then affects what we do to reality to achieve that. So it's circular. It goes back and forth. Materialism always wants to recognize how the base affects these ideas that we then implement. That's what I think Marx is getting at here is if we once after the earthly family, so just the real conditions of the family is discovered to be the secrets of the Holy Family, the ideas of family, what we mean by a family. Those ideas of what a family is changes what a family is going forward because you're interacting with it different now. The reality of just like one hun parent, one male sperm giver, one hun female whole, and then a offspring now turns into this parental dynamic of a father and a mother and child, which then turns into what does this concept of parents mean? And then we get these different ideas of family and family structures and how that changes. But like the modern family wouldn't exist without the ideas of family coming prior, and those ideas of families prior wouldn't exist without the structures they existed in. So it's this cyclical idea, and this is also and yeah
Oh, yeah, I just I keep talking about the book I was just reading, but he talks about this again. Okay, he gives a great example, a real world example. He said of how your ideas are the superstructure and they follow the base, and then go and influence them. So he says, let's say you have a shoemaker who is a private and he loses his job and he has to go work in a shoe factory. Okay, his ideas at first, he's originally thinking, oh, I'm just going to save up enough money to reopen my own shoe business. He has a petite bourgeois mentality still, but his conditions have been reduced to that of a proletarian. Yeah. So his superstructure lags behind his base. But then he lives out the life of a proletarian working in a factory, and he realizes he can't save enough money to reopen his private shoe factory or his private shoe business. And even if he did, he'd have to compete with the shoe factory and it wouldn't be a good idea. And then so his superstructure shifts. He realizes, okay, I need to join the union and get better wages. That's what I really need to do. And then so his ideas follow the change of his reality. And then these ideas, his idea that, oh, I can join the union and we can make the boss pay us more money, that will influence his base.
yeah. I mean yeah. I mean if you think to our own lives, I know I know you work at a co-op. I'm sure working at it has affected your views of co-ops.
Definitely has affected my view. And also,
Yeah.
you've seen how it's affected people who don't, who never even gave any thought to um, owning your own means of production, having a say in your own workplace. And there are people like one coworker, they thought they were applying to a grocery outlet, accidentally applied to Rainbow, came there, and their whole I think I've seen it transform their attitude and their outlook on things, and I've kind of tried to fan the flames of that as much as I can. But yeah, just yeah.
Yeah.
It seems very like it's from the way you guys are explaining it. It's like the application of thesis antithesis, just making the cycle.
What is this?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, where it's literally applying that to a real world thing, where you're seeing, as what you're saying, what you're saying, where the base lies behind, where the superstructure lies behind the base, but you're, yeah, and as we're saying, like, yeah, what will radicalize you, what will change you is a drastic change in your circumstances. And they'd be like, oh, this is significantly different than what I thought it was supposed to be. And that will have an effect on your attitude towards the world.
Yeah. So yeah, that's thesis four. Yeah. But yeah, moving on to five and six. Um, five is pretty short, honestly. Feuerbach not satisfied with abstract thinking, wants contemplation, but he does not conceive
Sensuousness.
sensuousness as practical human sensus activity. Uh, that's the thing. I had to look it up.
I feel
It's a synonym for consciousness. I like so.
like the ability to sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think he means like sense, like feeling. Not like now we think of sensuous as a synonym for like sexual, but I think it means like feeling.
yeah,
We also think of it as perception.
yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Like
Because that's what they're always talking about, right? The idealists, like a lot of the idealist philosophers are always talking about, like, are our senses real? Are we
Yeah.
just thinking them,
There you
or
go.
like, right? They're trying to think of what's real. Maybe our thoughts are the only real thing, and the senses are a reflection of something or other, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of relates to that, I guess.
yeah. I mean, the way I interpret it is if we're looking at this as being consciousness, as like being aware and interacting with the world through your perceptions, it kind of changes what this means a little bit as being conscious is a practice. It is activity. It's a practical activity. This idea of separating thoughts, yeah, this idea, benefit.
It's very like it requires thought to be conscious.
Yeah, and though that's activity, that is real. He doesn't like to Marx, as far as I'm aware, this idea of separating mind over matter, mind is matter.
Yeah.
The thoughts, this whole idea of base and superstructure ideas are still real and material,
Yeah.
but it's you're setting something in motion. The outside is affecting inside. It's an activity. Thoughts on activity, and then implementing it is what is like actually doing something with it is what then makes them matter. But that's how I read through it. Like I said, I in my head replace sensuousness with a consciousness. To me, it makes it a lot easier to understand. Going forward into the next one, hmm, Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence. But the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter upon a criticism of this real essence, is consequently compelled to one, to abstract from the historical process and fix the religious sentiment as something by itself and to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual. Two, essence therefore can be comprehended only as genius, as an internal dumb generality which naturally unites many individuals. So, what I want to get y'all's reaction about this before I go into my thoughts.
It seems to me that he's critiquing Feuerbach's attempt to come up with some kind of universal picture of human nature, which would be idealist.
Yeah,
I mean, the human essence. I mean, smacks of idealism, and he seems to just point out that whatever he's found, whatever he finds here is empty and just doesn't say much of anything really.
yeah, and like that's yeah, no, I don't disagree. That's what Marx is getting at. But also, I think it's a deeper attack of this idea of individualism and individual things.
What
I
does he mean
think
by abstract?
abstract kind of like like uh like to either take out or isolate. I'd say here. So presuppose an abstract, isolated individual. Basically, it's like you are you. Let's just take you as an individual and talk about ideas of self through you. You're abstracting, you're taking that individual out of society, out of community, out of personal history. That's what I think he's getting at here with abstract is more like you're taking the individual out of the context of the world, trying to study the individual as the essence of of humanity too, which can be done in a sense. There's this whole sociological idea of the sociological imagination, but if you focus just on the individual, I think what Marx is trying to say is if you're trying to study religion through isolating the individual, you're not studying anything. You're just creating ideas and pretending those ideas are valid. The person has a history, community, living world around them that influences those religious sentiments.
This is like a trend in idealist philosophy where they start with the perfect idea and then they extend that to the single individual and then they extend it to many individuals. But this is just completely ahistorical. And this is actually in a wide reaching of idealist philosophy or like ideas. Like for example, um, Adam Smith's thought experiment of the two individuals trading, right? That could never have happened in history. It never did happen. It's an idealist representation to explain something. Marx is saying you have to go to the real history of things to understand that that's the only way. He's once again saying the material conditions precede the ideas to a certain extent.
Yeah.
It's kind of repeating himself in different ways.
Yeah, he does that a lot in this work, honestly.
But there's lots of ways to say the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But did anyone else have more ideas before I move forward? Oh,
It seems very much like in the bottom in part 6, where he's saying that Feuerbach resolved the religious essence into human essence, but the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each individual. So I understand that. He's saying that we can't, as you were saying, you can't just like say, oh, this is the entirety of society, the higher human experience. And this, well, that's there's heavy confirmation bias from learning with one person. Like that's just one thing. You can't say, oh, the individual. Instead, reality is the ensemble of the social relations. So Marx seems to be arguing here that you're getting this from human society. Like that's actually what essence is. The human essence is the collective is humanity, is not just the individual human, but is humanity. But then in the bottom one in part 2, is that essence therefore can be comprehended only as genus, as an internal dumb generality which naturally unites the many individuals? Is that something he's saying that Feuerbach is compelled to argue? Because that seems like that's the same thing that he's arguing there.
I think
that.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think what he's saying there is the idea of a single human nature that you can extract out of individuals isn't possible. When he says genus, I'm thinking, knowing Marx, he's probably referring to like genus of species and such. So
Yes, that's
yeah. So if we're looking at it as like that, he's basically saying. Actually, let me go back to last week's lecture for a second. We talked a little bit about this idea of species being, of this idea of what it means to be human is like all these social things, and there's a lot to that lecture. I'm not going to repeat the entire lecture, but I want to kind of think of this through the idea of species being for a moment. What I think he's saying is if we pretend there's a single human nature here outside of society, you're kind of stupid. It's a dumb generality, which tries to unite many individuals. I think he is saying Feuerbach is saying this,
Okay.
but I think he's doing the thing where it's like Marx will agree with someone, but disagree on the nuances.
Okay. Yeah.
Where Marx was like there's a human nature, but if you say it's a individual human nature, then you're wrong. I think what he's saying is Feuerbach assumes an individual human nature, not a collective human nature.
Yeah.
I think that's what he's getting at here. Yeah. Does that make sense with this? I could be off.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So moving on to 7 through 10, since they are each really short. Um, so 7 Feuerbach consequently does not see that the religious sentiment is itself a social product, that and that the abstract individual whom he analyzes belongs to a particular form of society. I feel like that's pretty straightforward, but is anyone unsure about what that's saying?
Well, I just thought that there was a. It's interesting to think that he says that the abstract individual whom he analyzes belongs to a particular form of society. I think you can view that as almost saying that not even every society could even imagine an abstract individual. Right, we are able in our modern society to think about abstract individuals because of the permeation of capitalism and individualism. But if you talk to a communal hunter-gatherer, they would be like, "What are you talking about? Individual humans don't exist. Like people only exist in groups and societies, right?"
You're referring to the last slide, right?
Well, I'm referring to this first one.
Okay.
It says, "And the abstract individual be analyzed to a particular form of society." And I'm saying that what you might be saying is that even the idea of an abstract individual belongs to our particular form of society. You can imagine a society where people can't even imagine abstract individuals because they live such a communal lifestyle. That's not where they would go to explain answers to society, but our philosophers do that because of the individualism.
Correct.
In the first place.
Yeah. Basically just says Feuerbach forgets to consider the society around the individual. Yeah. And then 8, all social life is essentially practical. All mysteries which lead theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice. And in the comprehension of this practice, he's just saying to me, what he's saying is exist religion exists from some rationality. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. I think that's what he's trying to say there. Not saying religion isn't real. Like he's not saying religion is real. He's saying religion forms because of because there's a rationale behind it.
Yeah.
People have a reason to believe what they believe. It affects their life in a material way. Otherwise, why would people believe it? It could be comfort so they can go to the job. The opium of the masses is that is the superstructure affecting the base. I think that's what I'm getting out of this quote is that even in religion, it affects people because it has a use to the people it's affecting.
Could we further define rationality?
Rationality, I would say that it makes sense to do something. I think that's what he's trying to use it to say is to the person from their lived experience, it makes sense that they would do what they do. I would argue that's what he's saying when it comes to rational solutions.
Yeah, I think you could replace rational solution with scientific explanation. And the sentence would make sense as well. All mysteries which lead theory to mysticism find their scientific explanation in human practice, as in you explain where they came from and why they exist, in an objective, real way that is based on history.
Yeah. Yeah, and then 9, the highest point reached by contemplative materialism. That is materialism which does not comprehend sensuousness as practical activity, is contemplation of single individuals and of the civil society. So I'm rereading my notes to remember how I interpreted this.
What does he mean by civil society?
Well,
So civil society is an interesting
it's
term.
because this is the time when we're seeing like the development of society, but also think about it within the historical context of this is the 1840s. The Enlightenment is tapering off. The Enlightenment ended, but the American Revolution has just happened within less than 100 years. And this idea that the Americans have stated very forthrightly in their amendments, they're like, you have certain rights and civil society is very clearly outlined, and they're literally like, yes, this is great because this is a bourgeois revolution that actually lays these rights out very clearly. And you have to carry society needs to be carried to the extent of the bourgeois revolution. So that you have to have a bourgeois society so you can then have a social revolution that can then grow out of it. So the idea is we have to go as far as Locke says, and as far as all the Enlightenment philosophists say, we have to explore the exact length of where is human nature, in an individual and in civil society. But then you have to move beyond the idea of individualism in civil society and then develop it as well. We have to have human society that goes beyond the ideas of just like laws and rights within as defined by law, and more the idea of we have obligations to each other as humans, as a collective species.
Yeah. Also, one thing I would add to this is remember, Feuerbach was seen as the materialist at this time, and Feuerbach basically kind of disregarded a lot of like ideas and like consciousness as being idealistic.
Yeah.
And Marx is saying, no, that's practical activity. That's materialism affects it, and then it affects materialism. It's a superstructure. So I think that's one of the things he's also getting at is a broad critique of materialism at the time, saying, hey, materialism is affected by consciousness. Living experiences, his subjective experiences, affect reality. Ideas, religion affects reality. It's also affected by reality. He basically sees base comes before superstructure, but superstructure still influences base. And I think what he's trying to get here is just once again a broad critique of materialism at the time, because materialists would disregard religion a lot. They'd just be like, "Oh, that's idealism." Marx would say it's more than just ideas if it's affecting people. If it's just ideas and they're not being acted upon, that's idealism. If they are being acted upon, that's what makes it material because it's affecting people's material conditions. I'd say that is what he's trying to get at here. And then the last point, 10. From the standpoint of the old materialism is civil society, the standpoint of the new who is human society or social humanity, which I think hits upon what you were saying.
Yeah, I was combining 9 and 10, but saying that I think we have to move on.
Yeah, I think after reading this, the civil society, I think he might be saying the civil society is like a society that views itself as a collection of individuals.
Yep.
It's an individual way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And he's saying that the new society is supposed to be people viewing themselves as a collection of people.
Yep.
And you can't actually separate the individual from the collection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's used because we don't use civil society to mean that necessarily today. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little confusing.
Yeah. And then the final point, the famous quote by Marx: the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
Yeah. Which is kind of what all the theses are really laying on.
Yeah.
It's very much is saying, it's saying like,
Other times.
yeah, I mean, because they were at this crux of time when you were within their lifetime, you're seeing almost within a lifetime, you're seeing the first time you're actually seeing rights of free speech and things actually laid out as law instead of just like, well, it's tradition, but actually no, it's the law. Is you're allowed to say this, or we're actually getting into things like, well, why does the Prussian government have censorship rights or all these things? Like, why is this acceptable? Why is this thing? And so these things that are, things now like, oh, like free speech, but they were very big fans of these concepts. No, free speech is a really, really good concept. This concept of free speech and individual rights is very important and very necessary because it's within that framework that you can then develop a consciousness of people as individuals and you can then push it together. You can then push it towards a collective consciousness.
Yeah.
This was written before 1848, right?
Yes, this was
Because
written in.
that's a shift for them, right? Where they move away from liberal ideas, or
Yes.
they move away from their more positive view of liberal ideas, because they still thought liberalism was a progressive form. 1848 is where liberalism really becomes a shifts in history to become a no longer progressive.
Just when they
Yeah.
they call it the limit.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
You'll see a constant chipping away at this idea of incremental like changes. They go like when they do write the manifesto, which we'll cover next week, they do talk about how first there's primitive communism, like society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. And he does start to chip away at this idea of do we need a capitalist middle ground before getting to socialism? He still believes you need socialism before communism due to the nature of how he conceptualized communism. But he does start to chip away at that exact idea of like, hey, maybe societies don't progress in this linear way. That does keep getting more and more chipped upon as he continues throughout his life.
I think this is one of the ideas of Trotsky that I actually like that he talked about in one of his books I read, which is the theory of combined development, which is the idea that like capitalism had to supersede socialism the first time. The first capitalism had to come about before socialism ever, the first time where there'd be no proletariat. But then combined development happens, where the countries develop much faster because the technology has already been introduced and stuff like that, and almost skip or have a very short intermediate stage. I don't know the practicalities of that, but that's what I understand a little bit. Yeah, Brian.
The point that Trotsky makes is also that the development of capitalism in one country changes the conditions in another country.
Yes.
That's why it's uneven and combined development.
Yes.
Because the development of capitalism in the imperial core also meant the development of semi-feudalism in the semi-colonies and the colonies. Because the imperial forces come into the colonies and the semi-colonies and develop them partially because they need them partially developed, but not fully developed, because then they would no longer be dependent upon that. So Trotsky makes this point that because of this, the simple idea of stages no longer works.
So I'm going to start moving forward a bit, just because I know a few of y'all really want to debate on anarchism. So I'm going to try to make sure we hit that before the end of today's lecture. But yeah, so Feuerbach, it's an important work, but also it's was never fully developed. It was a set of notes. But Marx did in the German ideology and a few other works deal with Max Stirner. Now I don't know much about Stirner. I'm going to be completely real with you. So most of what I'm saying in this is based off of the book I've been referencing for a lot of this class, which is A Will to Win. So just so you know, if I say something like, I don't think Max Stirner was like that, please correct me. But he was considered an early anarchist and wrote a book called The Ego and His Own. Just more of a fun fact there. And Marx and Engels were a target of Stirner because he was an anti-Semite and Marx is Jewish, and Stirner had this joint connection with this proto-eugenicist, Johann Blumenbach. Dude, I actually do know about because I had to do a presentation on him before. Um, who developed this idea of basically racial superiority. Um, Stirner, to my knowledge, saw try to combine race and religion in progress, where he saw religion as being pure idealism, which Marx kind of just he doesn't agree. He creates these ideas of phantoms, these like spooks that live in reality. And in addition to that, religion has this hierarchy where like white Christians are the top and Jews are at the bottom and all the in between. Obviously, Marx doesn't agree with this. Marx is Jewish. And Marx and Engels really attacked Stirner a lot in the German ideology because of this. So, in addition to that, they didn't want to just attack the character, they wanted to attack his idea of ego, which he was like, this idea of ego under Stirner they saw as really idealist because you're separating the ego from the self rather than just the person as a whole. The ego is not separate from you. It's not separate from your hunger, not separate from your sleep, not separate from anything you do. This idea of it being a separate idea that exists in your head compared to the material body is just backwards. At least that's the critiques I learned from my little research. Then we continue with the German. German ideology is a very important work for them. This is where they fleshed out a lot of their ideas. It's uh, it continued Marx and Engels' abandonment of of idealism and just using these terms idealism. They were like, if you consider yourself an idealist, sure you're an idealist. That's also a stupid thing to be. That's basically was the outlook. Um, because their whole thing was okay, you have these ideas, you have these beliefs. Where do they come from? That's partly why I wanted to start the lecture off with talking about, hey, how does your history influence where you are? In addition to that, you have Marx and Engels saw liberation through collective activities, while Stirner and others saw it through the individual. Stirner and a lot of thinkers around this time saw if you can free your mind, you free yourself. Marx Engels like cool, you can think independently, but you're still shackled to the machine. Um, but yeah, although there was many attempts to publish the German ideology, it never did get published. They tried and tried and failed and failed. Eventually, they wouldn't hate this work though. They would never look back at this as we failed at being able to publish this. Rather, they look back at this as hey, this allowed us to define our terms, how we view ourselves in society. It was one of those things where they were like, okay, this is how things work. This is how we view the world. But after the German ideology, things were difficult. Engels, who comes from a bourgeois family, was hit with financial hardship and was made to work at his father's factory. He by work at his father's factory, I mean like be a manager of like many factories in England, not actually like work on the factory floor.
Yeah.
He was still the son of a business owner. So Engels wasn't able to really support Marx financially for a while during this time. And Marx's deportation really affected him and affected his work because he lived in his ideal community, this a place he wanted to be surrounded by, to barely getting by, living living in the refugees areas of Brussels, and just being ripped away from the world he was building. This forced Marx to remove any remaining notions of idealism. He was no longer able to. His conditions changed, so had his ideas. But not always lost for Marx and Engels. You'll see going forward, I start using M and E a lot in these slides. Or saying Marx and Engels 50 million times on these slides takes up too much space. So they create a new organization, the International Communist Correspondence Committee. I don't know for sure, but I assume this is the first international.
Not yet.
Not yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
First national technically it's in 1865.
The first thing they called it international.
Fine.
Yeah, this is like an idea from getting ideas from committees of correspondence, like things that are coming around in Rupture. Getting ideas for let's have a correspondence committee to start to link people together internationally and start it's like the point five, like let's start writing and start talking to each other because before we can come together and form an international workmen's association, we have to like start connecting with other people who think similarly around the world.
So yeah, and they're exactly. Hey, and yeah, I honestly didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you with that. Can I say that's one of the reasons why I love this class is like y'all help me fill in the gaps I don't know about Marx, and like it makes it such a great discussion. Like, thank y'all for that. But yeah, so this like first committee, they had two goals. One, obviously attack the bourgeoisie and aristocracy through writing, but they also wanted to support universal voting, civil rights, just broad freedoms. Now, this group did fall apart. There was a mix of liberals, anarchists, socialists, everyone who was like, hey, we don't really like monarchy, basically.
Yeah.
So it had a lot of infighting. And Marx, at this time, had a very linear view of change. He still saw capitalism as a prerequisite for socialism and communism. I said this will get chipped away with throughout his life, but he still has a very like linear approach to things. And this time he also writes a book called Poverty of Philosophy, of where he's like, you know what, this one dude Proudhon, let's just make him hate me now. So he takes a relatively small work, it's not super small, but compared to the Poverty of Philosophy, it's small, and writes a large critique of it. Now, Marx and Proudhon had an interesting relationship. We discussed a few weeks ago, but Proudhon, Proudhon, uh, Proudhon kind of saw Marx as a teacher, and Marx saw Proudhon as a pest. Um, and Proudhon was like warning Marx, like, "Hey, it's not, hey, you're kind of creating a new religion out of your theories. Don't become another Martin Luther." Marx was like, "Well, I'm just saying correct things, so like, get fucked." Um,
He's not wrong.
so,
What do you wish he was?
but like, so he writes. So Proudhon writes this idea, this book called "The Philosophy of Poverty."
Yeah.
It was meant to be how do ideas cause people to become impoverished.
Yeah.
You're like you're homeless because you don't have these ideas of like of working well enough. Marx is like, okay, cool. So I'm gonna write a book called the Poverty of Philosophy, taking down everything you've said. And the few key differences were Marx saw economics as social, Proudhon saw it as trying to tie it to the individual, which Marx sees as a mistake. Marx saw people having increased needs as being the reason for increasing production. You know, there has to be demand for more supply. Proudhon saw it as, oh no, if you just produce enough, people will eventually want it. it. Marx saw the idea of you having free choice in like choosing to like free choice in labor as yeah, you can uh choose who pays your bills, but you have to go to work in the way that'll best pay your bills. You don't really have a free choice in that. That was well, Proudhon saw it a bit differently. He and yeah, just like Proudhon was very individual, Marx was very collective. That's really how this can boil down to. Proudhon was against unions because they increased production costs. Marx was pro-union because they increased production costs and slowed down, though didn't eliminate machines replacing labor. This last point about unions hit home a lot for me because, as some of y'all know, I'm on a bargaining team for a union, and yeah, we are talking about AI and such. We don't. It's not going to be part of the contract, but we are talking about it. And AI is coming to replace a lot of our jobs, but through our union, we're slowing that down at very least. And we've seen with the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild, their efforts to combat AI. Is AI going to be gone from the film industry because of their unions? Not at all. Is it going to take a lot more time for them to infiltrate? Yes. And that is one of the things Marx gets at here with unions is unions don't stop the bad parts of capitalism from happening. They slow it down though. That's one of his big like takes out of that. And then we end a little bit with this part with theory and practice. There's ideas of concrete and abstract labor. They're interesting thoughts. Concrete material, abstract more like service labor. I'm not going to get into too much because the next slide is on anarchism. Not on anarchism, on authority, and yeah. So these slides are here. If you want to take a note, they will be on the canvas. But an interesting distinction, they become important in capital. So we'll probably dig these concepts back up when we get to that week. Marx also saw capitalism as economic anarchy, so just economics without rules. And yeah, the progression from Holy Family to German ideology to poverty of philosophy. Marx how Marx broke with a lot of the views of those who were like closest aligned with him. He because Proudhon was fighting for the same things as Marx. So was a lot of other people that he critiques. But he's like, no, you guys are still wrong. Here's where we need to be. So yeah, moving on to the fun discussion of on authority. So quick disclaimer with this, and I'll be honest, I'm not going to go over the entire slide. I know y'all are going to have at it anyways. I feel like Engels here, he's criticizing all those who oppose the use of force and authority. He combines it into his idea of authority, but I feel like the idea of it being a strict takedown of anarchism is a misreading. Because I think because before this class, I was reading a work that came out a year prior, also called On Authority by Bakunin. And there's no direct link on if Engels is trying to critique that or not, but he is critiquing Bakunin. I think the main thing Engels is trying to hit upon is something we see a lot with like modern day liberals, where it's this idea of, hey, we need to do things peacefully. We can't exert authority over others.
Yeah.
We need to do it in a way where we just need to convince them to agree with us.
Yeah.
I think that is mostly what he's arguing against. He's arguing this against Bakunin, but I think it's a misreading to place this in opposition to anarchism. I think it's in opposition to those who oppose the use of authority and the use of like in a lot of Marxist circles, and I'm guilty of this too, of like placing this as a read this to destroy anarchism is a misreading on the Marxist part, and then the replies to it are a misreading on the anarchist part. Because I feel like both sides end up missing the core of authority is needed to push things forward.
Yeah.
But that's enough of me yapping. I know you've annotated stuff. I know you've annotated stuff. Start us off.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think that you're right. I was trying to figure out what is the best way to start my conversation on this, and I think one of the good ways to start this is to quote Engels, where he says, if the autonomists confine themselves to saying that the social organization of the future would restrict authority solely to the limits within which the conditions of production render it inevitable, we could understand each other, but they are blind to all the facts that make the thing necessary, and so on. One, I think the use of the word autonomous is really interesting, and I think that that's kind of where it gets into what you're saying, is that this is not really a direct, I would hope this isn't a really direct takedown of anarchism. Because one of the things that I think he implies, and I'll get to this later, one of the things I think he implies here is that autonomy is an absolute good, that there are people who take autonomy as an absolute good. And I would say that I don't really think that fits into all anarchists. There are definitely some, if you get more, I see anarchism as a kind of gradation, or like as a spectrum, where you would have more individualists, like, Stirner and Proudhon probably would fit. Mutualism would probably fit a little bit closer to the individualism. Autonomy is the highest good, and then there's the social anarchism. And for me, I always try to operate in more of a sweet spot of, yes, using collectivism and all the benefits that come with collectivism to allow for more room for an individual to move around and exhibit an extent of autonomy. But anyways, so why I think this quote is a good place to start is because I think that most anarchists do confine themselves to that, where Engels is saying that, oh, well, if we confine themselves to saying the social organization of the future would restrict authority solely to the limits within the conditions of production, we can understand each other. Well, then, yeah, then we do understand each other, is what I would say to Engels. because I personally have never said anything different. I don't think in my discussions with Chris on this, I don't think Chris would say anything. Lots of anarchists that I've worked with and I have read would be in agreement with Engels here. Well, yes, of course. And I think authority can be used in many different ways. What the word authority and what is meant by an authority can be understood and used in many ways. Even anarchists use it in many ways. Bakunin used it in one way. He even says in What is Authority, he even says he's not opposed to it. Also, disclaimer, I don't really like to shackle myself to Bakunin or any philosopher. I think that is, Kropotkin is very dear to my heart as a person, but I would never chain myself solely to his um, philosophy. I think that goes in the face of anarchism. I think part of anarchism is to build upon stuff and is to have a sort of fluidity to develop your own ideas. But anyway, so Bakunin uses authority in one word, and where he says he's okay with authority. He's okay with authority in the sense of like expertise, you know? And he says that, I actually have the quote. He says that he is not opposed to submitting oneself to what to expertise, the classic quote from him is in reference to making boots, refer to the bootmaker. He has no problem uh, with that. Kropotkin uses authority in a different way in his book called Law and Authority. The way he's using the word authority in that situation is to mean legal authority, to talk about laws and, related crime and stuff. But there is a type of authority I think that he touches upon in that he is okay with. That he is saying that this is a type of authority that he's referring to, like habits and cultures and social norms and things like that. Those are types of authority that, as long as he is freely, it's kind of consent is the important thing here. Freely or involuntarily participating in something does not negate anarchism. One of my annotations here actually, where Engels goes, um, at least with regard to the hours of work, one may write upon the portals of these factories, leave ye that enter in all autonomy behind. I would say yes, do that. Because in the sense that Engels is using the word autonomy or authority here, I would say, yeah, of course, there is a sort of authority of steam or authority of just having to be on work on time. Sure. But the purpose is to create a society in which, as I said, I work in a worker-owned cooperative. I'm a cheesemonger. I love my job. However, if it wasn't for capitalism, I probably maybe would be there more like 2 days a week rather than 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 that I do sometimes, And maybe would be able to hire infinitely more people that could cover all the shifts, and no one would be having to do such significant amounts of work. But anyways, my point is, I have no issue putting aside some of my individual autonomy to serve my coworkers or my co-op, or to just do the thing I enjoy, which is working with cheese, and that requires me to be at work at 9 in the morning to open up the counter, or there at 10 o'clock at night to close up the counter. There's nothing in anarchism that says can't sacrifice some individual autonomy to do things that you want to do. Working together for the people is not authority, as far as I'm concerned, when it's voluntary and when it is informed and so on.
Yeah, and two things. First, we are over time. I'm going to keep this discussion going, or the live stream going, because I think this is an important and interesting discussion. But I do want to just mention we are at this point class is over, so if you want to stick around, highly recommend. If you gotta go, what we're doing next week is the Principles of Communism. That's the required reading. The optional is the Communist Manifesto. Manifesto is optional because, well, most of y'all have already read it. I'm not gonna make you reread it again for like the 50 millionth time, but you're invited to. And if you haven't before, it's a good read. And after you read Principles, it makes sense to read this because you now have built up enough understanding of Marx to really get the ideas that he's getting at in the manifesto. Also, next week it's going to be really interesting because we're going over the times of revolution. There was revolutions all over Europe. And we're gonna actually have a guest lecturer on Zoom for a little bit. My friend Lucas, he's gonna talk about German reunification, which happened about a month after the manifesto was published, and how that then affected things. Because after next week, it's no longer Prussia, it's Germany. But like I said, I'm gonna keep this discussion going since I know you had a lot, you have a lot, but class is over if you gotta skedaddle.
Do you all mind if I continue?
Oh, continue, yeah.
Get all my stuff out there, and then you all can respond when I write documents. So I think Engels mentions in regards to working, the hours fixed by the authority of steam, which care for nothing for individual autonomy. And he also says, and it is absurd to speak of the principle of authority as going absolutely as. Oh yeah, the principle of authority is absolutely evil, and the principle of autonomy as being absolute good. I don't really see it. I don't really. I know that it may come across, and this was mentioned earlier, that it may come across as redefining things or it's just tangential, but I do think that I'm under no obligation, or anyone else is under any obligation, to work within the framework that Engels is saying here. And if and I think part of that is because this reads better as not an attack on anarchism, I will say. If you try to read it as an attack on anarchism, it's probably one of Engels' weakest works. Um, and Yeah, because sure, if you were to ask Max Stirner, I'm sure he would say that autonomy is the highest form of good, But there's a reason why I don't really care for him, among many, because I don't see that. I'm more than willing to sacrifice some of my autonomy voluntarily to either serve something that's important to me, like the collective, like my store, like my job, like my passions, or even as simple as I think another example I thought of earlier was getting on the bus earlier. I let several people go ahead of me, even though I was in more of a position to kind of just impose my will to get past them. But I could care less about my autonomy in that moment, and just for the sake of these other people who seem more in a rush than I am, sure, go ahead. Step all over my autonomy to get on the bus first. I could care less. That has nothing to do. That has nothing to do to negate my anarchism, because for anarchists, I think what's most important is hierarchy, is like power structures, is really the ability to impose through like force or through structure and so on. That's hierarchy is more important to anarchists than autonomy, I think, is. At least from my perspective as an anarchist conquest. You ask a mutualist or an egoist, they might say something different.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, yeah, I feel like, yeah. I feel like when Engels talks about authority and autonomy, he doesn't see them as polar opposites. I think he sees them as related fields. Like to have authority and be is to be autonomous, but to not have authority is not to remove autonomy. I think he does separate them out a little bit. Hey, I uh, I feel like his main thing is yeah, like authority is a requirement to change the world. Any revolution requires authority, and especially a revolution that overthrows economic circumstances requires a violent revolution. I think his whole thing is, I don't see it as a broad critique of anarchism. I see it as a pointed attack on those who see authority as an absolute bad, which at the time also happened to be quite a few anarchists.
That's something I wanted to touch on. I would say yes, you're right, and I think in part of that was that a lot of that was them leaning on the individualist side at that time. And I would also say that it was still, I would consider it still very fledgling at that point. I would say that as a ism, it was very fledgling still. I would say that that's why I lean towards the tendencies. I lean towards more the social aspect, because I think it allows for that sweet spot to be met between, yes, you are an individual, you can freely associate, but also we need to keep up productive forces to meet everyone's needs. I think that's why I lean more social because you can hit that sweet spot better. Um, and yeah, like I said, I would take up the suggestion. Sure, put up signs in front of workers that say "Leave your autonomy behind," because that's being honest. That's the truth. And if you are, I'm more than happy to sacrifice and say autonomy on what I do Friday mornings at 9 a.m. to open up the cheese counter. I'm fine with that. One thing I do think that if he does, this is more. This would be more directly against anarchism. What he's saying here is that the whole idea of a commission and trusted, and he's saying that just changing the names of things, they think they've changed the things themselves. I think that's being a little intellectually dishonest. I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but and I also think it's a little bit like, as Engels supposing to be a great materialist, he seems to really, really not be getting the argument there of no, there is a fundamental change in the structure itself, in the material structure, in how the power flows.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's getting at there is more that because you're talking about this quote right here, I believe, which is I submit the arguments like these. So I feel like what he's trying to get at here is more of the running away from terms because you don't like what it currently implies. I know, and I'm sure you especially have faced this, like where when we're talking about like dictatorship of the proletariat, the term dictatorship is a scary term. So, or like the idea of scary terms. Yeah, I think that is also what he's getting at here is, yeah, like a delegate is different from a politician, but also it is a type of politician. It's okay to use the terms and not just run away from them. I feel like that is a thing he's trying to get at a little bit with this.
Well, I would say sure, but I think that there is something too where there is a difference between politicians or delegates as we understand them now, or as they would exist and function under a specific power structure, and how they would exist and function under a different power structure. I can care less about the terms. I care more about okay, what is the flow of power?
Yeah,
What is the flow of power? And like I said, I had my career is socialism. I work at a worker owned co-op. I own the means of my production. Some of the most rotten parts about what I work at comes from capitalism, comes from the outside world, comes from some of the, you know, capitalist brain rot that some of my coworkers have about no, you're only as useful as you are productive, makes me profit. That's where some of the issues I think with cooperatives come in, but I think it just exists under capitalism.
yeah. Um,
But another thing is
if it's
so
all right, I might put a pause on you
oh yeah,
because I know also you have quite a few critiques as well, which are like things you want to hit upon. So I want to just
yeah.
leave some space for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to define terms. That's what I always
Yeah,
it's like I think Engel's definition of authority that says authority is the ability to impose your will on another is very good definition. Like it's very comparable with what the dictionary says. I wrote down somewhere, which is the power or right to give order, make decisions, and enforce obedience. And enforcing obedience, giving orders is the ability to impose your will on others. So I think that's a fairly straightforward definition that I like. Um, and yeah, so and then I would say that using this definition, authority would require force to back it up. And that using this definition, authority without force would just not be authority. You would not have the ability to enforce your will without force. That's what the word intended means, right? At least my understanding. So the idea of trying to separate force from authority, I don't think that force and authority are the same thing, but authority requires force to back it up. And that is the whole idea of the state and all that, where the idea that the state is the sole monopoly on violence, right? You now, that sole monopoly on violence gives you the sole monopoly on authority, which is what the state loves to do, and it gets to organize society that way. That was the main things I wanted to say. Does anyone disagree with that?
No, I don't like defining terms.
seeing the two anarchists meeting like I have thoughts is hilarious.
Yeah, we would say sure. It's a
Wait, what?
How you define terms? Because a lot of these really old articles are really hard to argue with.
Oh yeah, I always do it myself because I always try to.
For what everyone.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's not a good way to start.
That's the problem. Because then you call passage up.
Yep.
Words.
Yeah.
You know what going on?
Well, I just think that multiple things are true at the same time. I think words can just have multiple meanings. And in this context, like I said, sure, in this context, sure, that's when I got to the whole part about Engels about being like, yeah, there is an understanding between us there. Yeah, sure. In that sense, in that use of authority, yeah, then there has to be authority in production. You know, sure. But I would say that's more organization. I would also say that
Obviously, organization is subcategory. Like proper organization on a scale just requires authority in somebody. There's always somebody who has to do the organization, or a group of people, but those people now have the authority.
yeah, and that's where the flow of power is important.
Well,
Well,
yes,
how do they get authority?
Oh
You know,
yes.
and
Well,
like,
so what I wanted to say about that, yeah, I think the solution to this problem is this idea of worrying about the authority figure is democratic centralism, which I mean I imagine you guys know what democratic centralism is. But
For us?
yes, no, I did. I did define it well.
Yeah.
Which is the idea. Okay, so this is the very gist. It's the idea of freedom of discussion, unity of action. Okay, so it's like a dialectical idea in my view a little bit of democracy and authority, where when we are deciding a thing, we go through a democratic process to decide to do the thing. But then once the decision is made, the people with the authority to execute the decision now have the authority to do it. We can't go like you can go back, but it's the whole idea that the democratic centralism was like it evolved in things like unions and stuff. And I think it is the natural democracy of collective groups like that. And it's required because let's say you can only get 95% of your group and you have a very loud minority that is 5% and hates what you did. If they every single meeting keep coming back and being like just talking about it endlessly, even though they're not convincing anybody of anything and they're just being annoying, right? You need the authority to say, okay, we're done talking about it now. We have decided and we are going to act now. The time for talking has passed. And that's what I think the democratic essentialism creates a circle where the people in authority are actually beholden to the people on the bottom when the decision making process happens. And then it no longer turns it into a linear hierarchy, but a circular hierarchy, where everybody kind of has an authority over each other to a certain extent. Yeah, and this allows for people to impose their will on each other, but it's fairly reasonable and things try not to get out of hand at the same time.
Yeah, I'm going to end the live stream at this point, I think. I would highly, if you want, you're welcome to join us after class for a bit. But yeah, I do want to end the live stream for now. I will say next week, just to reinstate what I said at the end of class, we'll ignore that part. We didn't get to the outro question anymore, but next week is the. I always have like an outro question in case I need to spark a discussion at the end of class to extend time.
Oh, that's a worry of yours.
It's not really a worry. It's more of a backup. But next week we're going over the Communist Manifesto. We're going to get a lecture on German reunification, and we're going to have a discussion on the principles of communism and the Communist Manifesto.
I'll learn what it is that day.
There we go. But yeah,